Chapter 5. This chapter focuses primarily on the information systems within a company that allows the various functions and departments within that company to achieve their day-to-day activities. And so we're going to look at a little more in depth as to what is all going on with these different systems. One of the key things that an information system in a company does and helps them to do is this whole idea of reporting and compliance. Especially publicly traded companies are required by government regulations to disclose a lot of detail about their operations, what their costs were, what their sales were, what their net profit is. And this is so that investors can make informed decisions. And so there's a lot of oversight and government regulation on that. Well, a good information system makes that reporting so much easier. It's just there. All you have to do is hit send, and the reports are filed with the appropriate agencies. Now, one thing that this does allow, and we're actually going to talk more about this in the chapter when we get to looking at dashboards for businesses, this idea of exception reporting. There's so much going on in business today. It's not practical for any management people to be monitoring every single piece of data, every report that's going on. Instead, what you want to do is to focus on the things that are not what you expected. So for any given parameter within the company, this could be a number of defects on the manufacturing line. No manufacturing line is 100% perfect all the time. You expect to have a certain number of devices, products to fall out at final QC. They get rejected for one reason or another. In each organization, there are people that know what is normal, and you can look at past data to determine that and say, we typically run between 95 and 98% on this. So you set your parameters and say, as long as we're getting at least 95% good products, everything is fine. You don't need to notify me. So you don't get a report on manufacturing defects because they are where you expected it to be. Now, however, if next week that number dropped down to 85%, management will get a report saying something has changed, so they can investigate, they can look into it. It may be a simple thing. They find out that, one of our machines broke, and before we realized it had made this many bad parts. And so we understand that was abnormal and it's been fixed. It won't happen again. But the point is, you focus only on the things that are not what you expected. I already mentioned compliance reporting, how the systems can really facilitate that. And what that does too is it can lead to an improved transparency between your company, your organization, and people who are interested in. That can be the government that has an interest in you. It can be investors. It can be clients. It gives you a more convenient way of easily providing information to those who are interested. Now, one thing that you can really utilize the computer systems for to help you with is the human capital management. Employees are an extremely valuable part of any organization. They're also expensive. And so managing that significant investment in the company is really important. And so there are tools that can manage your workforce, that manage your talent. I mean, it's fine to know that you've got these employees, but I mentioned, I believe it was last week, that I did some research for my boss. and found that the companies we wanted to talk to were located in Brazil, and all their websites were in Portuguese. A talent management system, if a good one, unfortunately, the company I worked for at the time didn't have a particularly good one. It was a really old, outdated system. But I'd be able to type in and say who in the company, if any, speak or read Portuguese. So you can use it to manage talents that are not directly associated with the current employee's job title. And that could apply then not just to Portuguese, but to Russian, to any number of languages you probably have in your organization. And if you capture that, then when you need that, you can call the person and say, hey, I need your help on this. You obviously work through their manager to get permission for them to stop doing what their job might be a custodian, but they've got these language skills. And so for a day, we relieve them of their custodial assignment and have them work with us. But the whole point is that there are skills and experience that can be useful to the organization, but only if we know that they are there and who it is that has them. And so the book shows some different ways that you can be looking at your human capital management. And we'll actually talk more about this, like I said, in the chapter on business dashboards, how you can utilize graphics to more rapidly convey information, and in this case, information about employees. So some of the metrics you could have in human capital that you're looking at is, do we have the talent we need? When I was working with local company Precision Interconnect, we decided that in order to reduce our cycle time, that we would bring circuit board manufacturing in-house. We found our customers were making last minute changes that we'd have to go to our circuit board supplier to request a change, and it was taking too long. And we figured out that if we did it ourselves, we could reduce that cycle time from weeks to days. But we didn't have any talent in the organization on how you set up a circuit board manufacturing line. So we had to hire someone in. But again, it's that idea of we were able to look and say, does anyone know anything about doing a circuit board line? Another metric that's really important to look at is who's leaving the company. Now, every company has turnover. And depending upon the position within the company, turnover may be high. People working on the manufacturing line, you may have high turnover there because it's a repetitive job. People get tired of it, or it's just there's a lot of competition for those people. But certainly you have a number of individuals in your organization that are essential to the company. And so are any of those key people leaving? And if so, why? And what can we do to keep those key people? Now, one of the ways that you do that when I work for Tyco Electronics is by offering stock options in the company. But the key is when you got awarded a stock option, you had to be still an employee. I believe it was 3 years later in order to be able to exercise it. But another thing now is are our employees as productive as we want them to be? So you monitor the output to see, are we getting the efficiencies and the production that we need? Now, it may not be the employees that are the reason you're not getting the production you need. It may mean that you have to redesign workflows, get different equipment in, provide additional training. So it's not pointing the finger that our employees are themselves unproductive. It's more to see, is the end result of the tools that we have given our employees, Are they able to produce what we want them to? And if not, we need to focus on that to improve that. And the author has a nice little chart in the book that shows some things that are monitored. And in particular, I wanted to highlight the turnover costs and the cost per hire. It's a tight labor market right now and has been for, I want to say, going on 10 years now. It's very expensive and takes time to get a new hire. And so when you lose someone, there's costs of, associated with that termination, hiring, training costs, trying to find that new person, advertising, the time it takes people in your organization away from their regular jobs to participate in interviewing. All that comes down to what companies should be doing is focusing on how do we keep our employees happy, committed to the company, and staying long term. There were two major companies in my working career. General Electric, I worked with for 14 years, and Tyco Electronics, that originally started out as Precision Interconnect, I believe that was 19 years. That's, in a perfect world, the kind of situation you want to have with your organization so you have stability. Now, bringing in new people with new ideas and new perspectives and ways of thinking about it is important too. So you kind of have to balance the two. But I think too often most organizations overlook how to keep those long-term employees that have a lot of history. There's a lot of, and this we covered in that first week's lecture, implicit knowledge that's, you only have that information, that understanding, because you've been there a long time. It's not documented anywhere. And so one of those long-time employees, when they leave, that walks out the door. That is very expensive to the organization. This chapter gets more into supply chain management. And of course, we're just touching the so-called tip of the iceberg with this. Not only could we have an entire semester or quarter just on supply chain management, you can get an entire 4-year degree in supply chain management. There's a lot of complexity involved in it, but it's important to have a basic understanding of a few key points. The simplest way to think of it is what supply chain management is trying to do is to optimize the flow of products from the raw materials all the way through the various, there may be multiple companies that have to touch that before you have a product that's delivered to the customer. And as we found with COVID, things can go wrong with that supply chain that create a big problem for your customers and the consumers of your product. So it's really important to be on top of your supply chain. And that really feeds into that the supply chain, another thing you're doing is making sure you're aligning the supply with the demand. Now, the way it used to be is that sales would make a forecast, and so the factory would build a whole bunch of units and put it in a warehouse and then ship as orders came in. And at some point you find out, well, we've way overestimated how much demand there would be, so we're going to have a warehouse sale and get rid of all this excess inventory. And then the Japanese, with I want to say input and direction and training from an American, Deming, came up with a different way of looking at it. And you can take whole courses and get certified in this, but one of the concepts is just-in-time manufacturing that says we're not going to just order a bunch of stuff and have it sit in the warehouse gathering dust. We're only going to have the raw materials that we need to do today's job. And then tomorrow, the raw materials will come in from our supplier for tomorrow's And the products that our finished products, we're only going to build what people need. And so it's an idea of having very little of your capital resources tied up in raw material or finished goods. It's a great idea, but it almost, it's difficult to implement because it's a constantly changing demand. I've included a little video in this course, and I'll talk more about the videos at the end of this lecture, how Ford manages the seats for their trucks to make sure that they have the right configuration of seat for the truck that they are building at that moment. So what are the IS functions that we can use for supply chain? One is the whole idea of planning. We need a tool that can look at sales forecast, past history of sales. When I worked at Tyco Electronics, I had all my major customers. I had their order history over the last 5 or 6 years. And with most of my customers, there was a seasonality to their ordering. Sometimes it's based on their fiscal calendar. If their accounting year ends in September, then I knew they wouldn't be ordering any product in August because they're trying to maximize the cash on hand for the end of year reports and everything else, and you could see that. And then you'd see after September, October, the orders were way up to make up for the stuff that they should have been ordering. But you understand what the seasonality is for your customers, and you feed that into the supply chain. That's one variable. That's looking backwards, how have things been done in the past. The other variable you want to include in your planning is looking forward. What is sales and marketing telling you that the future looks like? So it's not an either or, it's a both and. Now also we can use technology in our warehouse management. And again, I'll mention there's a video in this week's supplemental videos that shows how Amazon is using technology to manage their warehouses, and certainly managing the transportation. For many companies, your raw material and parts, sub-assemblies are not coming from across town or either from the next state over. They may be coming from halfway around the world. So transportation is not instant. You can't call up to your supplier across town and say, hey, I need this part. And they'll say, no problem, we'll have it there in 15 minutes. You don't have that. You're talking about weeks to get across the ocean, plus then getting through customs and finally getting delivered to your location. So managing that transportation is an extremely important part of the supply chain. And then, of course, using IS to help us in the manufacturing execution, being able to look and see, okay, our sales forecast and planning is telling us we need to make 100 of these units this week. So we need to have this raw material delivered to this manufacturing location. So the actual implementation of how do you get the product built. And this part, see, where companies are global, not just in where they're getting the raw materials from, but also in where their product is being sent to. When I worked at Tyco Electronics, the majority of my customers that we shipped to were in Europe and Asia. I did have some smaller customers in the US that we dealt with, but managing all the issues around global shipments to your customers, whether it's tariffs or currency exchanges, that's all part of, you can build into your tools with supply chain to help you manage that. So one of the technologies we use in supply chain, and mentioned this last week, the idea of using blockchain. Now, EDI is a term you will hear talked about as well. It was years ago, I want to say in the 80s, as companies started to have computers, they realized it would be really good if our computer could talk to your computer. And so they came up with a format, a protocol to use so that there's a structure. So when you send some electronic data to your customer, your supplier, they know that the first block is going to contain an address and then a time and date stamp and then the text, or however it's all structured so that it's a universal language. In the same way that PDFs were created so that you didn't have to be running the exact same software in order to communicate information. It's not as much an issue today as it was back in the 80s, where every computer system had its own proprietary data protocol. So a digital equipment corporation computer could not talk directly to an IBM computer mainframe without this electronic data interchange. And of course, the Internet of Things, that is something that we can use in our supply chain. It has become so inexpensive to put things like RFID chips in products so that you can track them. You know where they are. I think many of you may have used smart tags when you travel. It's this interconnectivity of things that allows us to monitor where things are and where they're supposed to be so that you can deal with it if something's wrong. And of course, that feeds into GPS as well. Lastly is robotics. And as I mentioned, there's a video in this week's supplemental that deals with and shows you how robotics in a manufacturing location can be utilized to fulfill that customer order. And so that's all part of the supply chain. Customer relationship management is a big topic. CRM is how it's abbreviated. In business, you will find that companies like to have 3 or sometimes 4-letter acronyms, abbreviations, instead of using the full words. So you'll find that you'll run into that. Unfortunately, while there's a lot that are used in common, you will find that there are some acronyms, 3-letter, 4-letter combination, that may or may not be the same from company to company or even within the company. So, but anyhow, I digress. Let's get back to CRM. The point of CRM is customer retention. It's 8 to 10 times as costly to get new customers as it is to retain existing customers. And one of the ways that you retain customers is by making them feel that they are appreciated and that they're not just a number. So good CRM tools provide a lot of customer background and really information, so that when you call into that support center, you get someone you've never talked before, but they're pulling up a screen that shows all your history so that they can leverage that. You don't have to repeat the story to them all over again. You know, you call in and they can say, "Oh, I see you called in about this issue you were having. Has that been resolved, or do you still need some help?" Right away, by showing that they have taken the time, even though it just comes up on a screen, to understand a little bit about you and why you might be calling in, that goes a long way. But let me give you a personal example of really good customer relationship management. I had a website that I hosted through GoDaddy. It was a website that had been developed by someone else using kind of an off-brand web tool. And I was having difficulty getting it fully imported into my GoDaddy site. Now, this was not a GoDaddy product. And so technically, their technical support didn't have to help me. They could have just said, well, we're not familiar with that software. You should talk to the person who created the website and get more information. But no, the person spent time helping me, pointing out ways that I could get around the problem I was having, and ultimately we were successful. So that was great. No charge to me. But before he hung up, he said, now, looking at your account, I noticed that you have several products here that you added 6 months ago that you haven't used. And, just said, is there a problem or what's going on there? And I said, yeah, I thought I was going to use those and set it up, and I just never got around to it. And now that I think about it, I'm not going to pursue that. He said, no problem. Why don't I cancel those for you? And since you haven't used it, I'll give you a complete refund. Now, that was quite a few years ago. I want to say 20 years ago. I'm still talking about it because that made such an impression on me. That's how you maintain customer loyalty and your retention, is by servicing it. And he was able to do that because he looked at my account and he saw something and he made a suggestion and an offer. And that really feeds into profitability because, as I said before, maintaining customers saves you money from having to go out and get new customers, but it also does something else. When you maintain that customer and they're happy, who do they tell? They tell their family and friends, business coworkers, others, that, hey, if you ever need this, this is a good company to work with. So it also helps build new sales. So it really feeds directly to profitability. And there's a number of companies that just don't understand this. They haven't put the time and effort into having good customer relationship management. And year after year, the number 1 and 2 and 3 of offenders who have bad customer service, it's always the telecom providers, AT&T, Verizon, Comcast. They have the worst customer relationship management in general. Now, I do have to say, in fairness, I have noticed a significant improvement in Comcast in recent years. They still got a ways to go, but they are doing a better job. Already mentioned that good CRM will increase your revenue. And this other idea too is having a good CRM where you listen to customers, you ask for feedback. Now, one of the ways is by sending out surveys to your customers and saying, hey, we'd really appreciate if you could take 2 minutes, fill out a brief survey. Now, the operative, recommendation I would make there is it needs to be brief. You want to tell someone, we respect your time. It just spares 2 minutes. We'd like your input on this idea that we're thinking of. I get probably every 2 weeks one from Wendy's where they're thinking about a new offering that they're going to have. And they may have 10 different names and how they're going to position it. And they're saying, which do you like best and worst and stuff. So it's a way with a good CRM tool, you can provide a feedback mechanism. So certainly with CRM, you can do email marketing, and I know all of us just love getting those email marketings, don't you? If you use it carefully. Email can be effective marketing. When I was at Shandaiwa, I made sure that 90% of my email newsletter that went out was beneficial information, had nothing to do with our company. Only 10% of it was product related, but the vast majority was just general information that would be useful to our customers. And so make your email content not just pushing product. Give them something in return for reading your email. You know, a new piece of information, a tip on maintenance of the product. You know, here's how to extend the service, you know, the life of your product that you bought. And the other thing I always included in my email marketing was a coupon for a significant discount, you know, 30%, 40% discount on a product for that month. You'll hear talked about Salesforce automation. And actually, one of the key companies involved in this is named Salesforce. And the idea here is that a salesman has to keep on top of a lot of information. A salesman may have 200 customers or more. And so when was the last time he called on this customer? Was there something he was supposed to do for them? Did they say, check back with me in 30 days? So keeping track of all this information so that the salesman, so something doesn't fall through the cracks, that's a huge part of CRM technology, and in particular focused on the Salesforce. Customer service and support, kind of talked a little bit about that with my example with GoDaddy. And here's an interesting thing. And I mentioned this either last week or the week before, that customers appreciate and want a mobile app to use to access your company. They don't want to have to be, you know, going on a web browser or looking for a phone number. They would much prefer to have an app on their cell phone that they could open up, access their account, that would have the key customer numbers that you need, so forth. So having a good mobile app, operative word there being good. There are some really bad ones out there that drive me crazy every time I have to use one of them. So don't skimp on the design and development of your mobile app. ERP, which really encompasses everything in the company. And as you see what the author has included here, they've got a chart of manufacturing, finance, HR, you know, your product development, these different supply chain. And really what they're trying to get across is that ERP resource planning integrates all the departments in your company with a, you know, a common interface, so that anyone within the company can access the information that they're supposed to be able to access. Another part of ERP is to ensure that people only have access to information that they are approved to have access to. So the assembly line worker cannot access HR's database of salaries. But it integrates and gives you one system to do all these things, instead of what happened in the past was we would have every department would have their own system. And the problem with that, I mentioned in an earlier lecture, is that information gets updated in the finance department's database, but doesn't get updated in the shipping department's database that there's a new address. So providing this one location and one interface is what ERP is all about. However, there is one part of the organization that may not be covered by this, and that's engineering. There are some engineering software tools, like, for example, Pro Engineer is a 3D drafting design software. ERP systems are not going to provide that. Now, what ERP will do is it will help manage the revision control and the location of those documents, but you're going to have separate engineering programs that actually create that document. This week's assignment is to take a look at failed ERP system implementations. And what I really want you to take away from this week's assignment is that implementing a new ERP system is not a simple task. Some huge major companies have failed at it, and some multi-billion-dollar companies have gone out of business completely because of a failed ERP implementation. So it's not something to take lightly. Okay, I mentioned earlier about the supplemental videos, and I just wanted to remind you where to find it. You go to the course content tab, go down to week 5, and then you'll see that first thing under the lecture video is supplemental videos. And on there, this is some of them. There's actually 3 or 4 more that are there too. These are all relatively short, 4 or 5 minute videos, but they have some really good information in them to really emphasize and clarify some of the concepts we talked about today. In particular, the Amazon warehouse robots is interesting just to see what they're doing. How in the world have they been able to get down to same-day shipping? The toilet paper shortages and the supply chain, that really deals with what happened at the beginning of COVID. That's an interesting one. Just-in-time manufacturing, it's a little one that shows you the concept of how that works. It can be challenging to implement, but it's good to have that basic understanding how that works. And the one that I think actually points out a very important thing, the bullwhip effect. Now, it's a little, you might say, corny, cartoonish type presentation, but it really gets across a good point that when you have your supply chain reacting to unusual changes, either up or down, that along the supply chain, each step along the way tends to overreact. And so what you end up with is, by the time you get down to the end, you get wild variations going on. And the key is to understand that is an issue with supply chain, that you can have these. And again, when you're using exception reporting, that can get flagged and saying, whoa, our customer is placing an order that is way out of norm. What's going on? And that actually happened to me. One of my customers placed orders for assemblies that didn't make any sense to me, way out of the norm for it. And so I called up the purchasing agent and just said, hey, I appreciate the large orders coming in, but I just wanted to check and see what's going on. Are you having a fire sale, or what? Why the need for all the additional product? And he thanked me and said he was just about to call me and tell him what was going on. They had just implemented a new ERP system, and they were having all kinds of problems, and it was spitting out orders that it shouldn't be, ordering too much of this, not enough of that. And so what I told him, I said, well, why don't I, based on what you have ordered in the past, what I would suggest that we send you this quantity of this item and this item, and I just proposed to him, and he just said, yes, let's do that, until now they eventually got their ERP system figured out. But again, it was that idea that they'd had a change that occurred. I could have just entered in their orders into our system and told manufacturing, ramp up, because our customers going gangbusters, and plan for this continuing on into the future, and created a real problem in the organization because it would have quickly fallen back down. And so it's it really, to me, it represents a couple of concepts. The one is the use of exception reporting, focus on something that looks out of the norm. And another key thing is that communication is important. I didn't send an email. I picked up the phone and called them real time. And supply chain software, ERP software, those are tools, but you still have to use your brain. Does this make sense? And if not, I better do some investigation and research. And there's a couple of really good examples of good customer support. I like the last one where the guy's talking about glasses. Just a perfect example of how you can make a customer feel special and they become a lifelong customer.